Why does nobody talk about the young and innocent 13-year-old girl on a breeding farm, forced to bear as many children as possible, only to have them ripped away and sent down south to endure a lifetime of hardship without a mother? Slave breeding farms were undeniably a dark and troubling time in American history that sends shivers to your spine. Those women were compelled against their will to bear the burden of carrying these children through their agony. They were often subjected to cruel treatment, and their primary function was that of a method of reproduction. They had no say in who they were forced to mate with, and they had no control over their own bodies and privacy. Welcome to History Rediscovered. In this episode, we discuss the disturbing events on the breeding slave farms of Virginia. Slave breeding was the practice in slave states of the United States of slave owners to systematically force the reproduction of enslaved people to increase their profits. It included coarse intimate relations between enslaved men and women, or girls, forced pregnancies of enslaved women, and favoring women or young girls who could produce a relatively large number of children. The primary objective of these plantations, which were operated in a manner not unlike that of businesses, was to increase the number of slaves that were made available for purchase on the market. Because America's economy was built on the availability of cheap labor. By the 1820s, many planters and would-be planters had relocated to formerly uninhabitable areas, and were growing the fiber for export to Europe and New England, where a thriving textile industry was emerging. More workers were needed to expand the so-called Cotton Kingdom. Planters were no longer able to import new slaves from Africa or the West Indies after Congress banned the country from taking part in the global slave trade in 1808. Instead, the only practical way to increase the population of slave laborers was through births. Black women's reproductive function grew politically and economically significant because there was so much at risk. The South could not remain a slave civilization if enslaved mothers did not have enough offspring to replace the elderly and dying laborers. Every woman of childbearing age was required to have children. Early in the 19th century, slave owners sought explanations for barren women's lack of pregnancies in heaven and on earth. They were prepared to accept a role for providence, but they also carefully examined the woman's actions and the environment she lived in. Owners typically held to the discriminatory presumption that all black women were fertile, more so than whites, and would reproduce if given the opportunity. Most ensured that women had access to a partner, even if that meant enduring the visits of an enslaved man who resided on another farm or buying more slaves, in order to provide them the chance to become mothers. Jacob Dickerson was initially bought by a Mississippi plantation named William Alford. Soon after, he purchased Sally. He told Jacob, "I brought you a good woman, take her and live with her," when he brought Sally home. The couple agreed, and their son claims that they then led happy lives. Although not all slaves submitted to planter matchmaking docilely, it is easy to understand why some couples were prepared to mate in such conditions, given that the majority of enslaved individuals want to be married and start families. Any couple who did not have an owner's consent might not be allowed to use resources such as money, or the owner's support in keeping family ties. 3. Nobody could guarantee that a slave pair would be permitted to stay together, but everyone was aware that an owner was more inclined to respect a union that had been sanctioned. Only those couples who were given permission by the plantation owner to get married were given access to separate homes with furniture, plots of land for growing food, passes to visit one another if the husband and wife were on different plantations, and other perks of married life. For these reasons, a woman or man would have given the owner's marriage proposal careful consideration before declining. Not all slave owners bought spouses for individual slaves. Those who didn't might find various ways to pressure women into having children. Several encouraged or insisted on marriage in order to capitalize on an attraction that already existed. The Civil War started the year Jacob Thomas married Phoebe. Jacob subsequently claimed that their romance lasted for a short while because the master approved of their union. According to Georgina Gibbs' testimony, her Virginian master would marry any pair he observed interacting. She may have meant that he would insist that they cohabitate as husband and wife. Mild pressure frequently had positive results for young people who were feeling the flush of their first love and sexual attraction. An owner who suspected a pair of courtship would utilize various inducements to convince the man and woman to start a family. In addition to separate homes, tiny plots of land, and passes, these could also include time for household chores, hens, or other animals. The birth of children was followed by rewards for motherhood. They included more clothing, release from severe punishment, and occasionally, freedom. As a result of having children, some women were able to escape hard labor in the fields or elsewhere. Former slave Douglas Parrish said that a breeder always fared better than the majority of female slaves. 5 slaves aggressively sought out prizes for motherhood from owners because they saw them as unusual entitlement. Henry Bobbitt, a former slave, claimed that many marriages only lasted 5 years, because men and wives were expected to find new partners if no children were born within that time. A woman's inability to reproduce was not always indicative of her infertility. The ability of a woman to carry children was frequently poorly determined by slaveholders. When Minerva, a slave, suffered severe burns and scarring, her owners were disappointed because they had anticipated she would be a good breeder before to the event. It's unclear if they thought she wouldn't be able to find a partner, conceive, or carry a child to term, or perhaps all 3, but their prediction was incorrect. Many children were born to Minerva, including the woman who bears her name, Minerva Davis, who revealed these details many years after slavery had come to an end. The slave owner's poor judgment in these situations was partly a result of widespread misconceptions about the reasons for infertility, as well as the challenges of forcing certain intimate connections on others. For instance, owners were unaware that a woman needed to mate during ovulation in order to become pregnant. These kind of errors help to partially explain why some slave owners try to personally interfere in the sexual relationships between their slaves. By requiring that couples get an owner's consent before meeting, they attempted to organize courtship. Some mistresses and masters even went so far as to compose love letters on the slave's behalf. Although forced pairings weren't frequent, slave owners occasionally tried them. Some former slaves alleged that owners forcibly bred slaves in order to improve their stock as well as increase their workforces. Henry H. Butler asserted that his former employers would only let unions between individuals they anticipated to generate progeny with excellent physiques and those they considered it a proper mating. Other sources mentioned stockmen who were tasked with being studs. A former slave said that a stockman would spend the night imprisoned in a room with pregnant ladies. He would be questioned about what had transpired in the morning. His owner would not receive payment for his services if he did not engage in intimate activity. The women would object to him. The mother of Emma Barr of Arkansas claimed that one of her owners kept a fine man whose job it was to conceive the housewives. Emma reported her mother's claim. The other slaves, both men and women, hated him, indicating that any man who participated in such a scheme would be despised by his fellow slaves. The man did not perform any difficult labor. William Maddox, a Louisiana plantation owner with extensive slave holdings, permitted the majority of slaves to choose their wives, with the exception of roughly 10 ladies who he bred with a big man. He sought out children with good physical condition who may fetch a fair price. Nonetheless, few landowners made an effort to procreate slaves through forced unions. These were unnecessary because slaves were more likely to have children than free people. One slave owner in Mississippi claimed that since slaves established relationships on their own, no studs were required. Yet, slave owners did little to prevent slaves from anticipating the use of force. The fact that so many former slaves remembered tales of forced coupling on nearby estates, if not their own, suggests that this potential threat alarmed slaves. Yet, slave owners did little to prevent slaves from anticipating the use of force. The fear brought on by the potential for coerced breeding was genuine and pervasive. Forced intimate encounters between white men and black women were more frequent than forced marriages among slaves. The master, his sons, nearby planters, guests of the slaveholding family, traveling salesmen, and hired laborers were among the potential intimate partners of enslaved women. Although slaveholders used a number of methods to interfere with human reproduction in the slave quarter, they did not always find the outcome satisfactory. Their attempts were repeatedly thwarted by slaves' steadfast determination to maintain control over reproductive issues. America does not generally teach about the practice of slave breeding in its schools. It excuses those who were simply following the practice of the times. There has been no offer of restitution of reparations to black descendants. It was something preferred, forgotten, or, better yet, never known.